The late autumn wind howled through the streets of Cheyenne like a mournful spirit, rattling the shutters of Margaret Anderson's once grand home. 10 years ago, it had been the crown jewel of the growing railroad town, but now the white paint peeled from its wooden bones like dead skin. Inside, Margaret sat at her mahogany desk, trembling fingers tracing the edges of another foreclosure notice. Her late husband Robert's debts to the Taylor Railroad Company had finally come due, and with them, an unthinkable demand. Her three daughters, Rachel, Laura, and Susan, huddled together on the settee across the room, their faces pale in the flickering lamplight. At 19, Rachel was the eldest, with Laura at 17 and Susan barely 16. They were all Robert had left her, and now even they were being threatened. The railroad's enforcers had made it clear. Either Margaret would surrender her daughters into indentured service to pay off the debt, or they would all be thrown into the street. Henry Walker watched the Anderson house from his position in the shadows of the livery stable across the street. 5 years ago, he'd been the most notorious train robber this side of the Mississippi, but a promise to a dying friend had set him on a different path. That friend had been Robert Anderson, and his last words still haunted Henry. "Watch over them, old friend. Keep them safe." He'd failed in that task, but perhaps not completely. The story of Margaret Anderson's plight had spread through Cheyenne like wildfire, but few dared to challenge the Taylor Railroad Company's iron grip on the territory. Their private army of gunmen, led by the ruthless Frank Clark, had crushed any opposition to their expansion. But Henry knew something they didn't. He knew where their money was vulnerable, and he knew the men who could help him hit them where it hurt. Daniel Moore sat in his usual corner of the Deadwood Saloon, nursing a whiskey and watching the world through tired eyes. When Henry walked through those swinging doors, Daniel knew his peaceful retirement was about to end. They had ridden together in the old days, before Daniel found his calling as a master of disguise and confidence schemes. The look in Henry's eyes told him this wasn't a social call. "Three innocent girls, Daniel," Henry said quietly, sliding into the chair across from his old friend. "Taylor Railroad's going to enslave them for their father's debts. Robert Anderson saved our lives in '73, and now his family needs us." Daniel's weathered face showed no emotion, but his fingers tightened around his glass. "You're talking about going against the biggest outfit in the territory. We'd need the old gang, all of them." Charlie Taylor, no relation to the railroad family, was living under an assumed name in El Paso, working as a demolitions expert for the mining companies. Martha Walker, Henry's sister, and the finest scout who ever rode the border territories, had vanished into the Dodge City gambling halls. They would need them both, along with Daniel's skills and Henry's leadership, to pull off what he had in mind. The plan was audacious. The Taylor Railroad Company's main payroll train would be making its quarterly run from Cheyenne to their headquarters in 2 weeks. Over $200,000 in gold and banknotes, enough to pay off the Anderson family's debts 10 times over and still leave plenty for the gang. But Frank Clark would be guarding that train personally, along with 30 of his best men. Henry spent the next 3 days watching the Anderson house, his heart heavy as he observed the three girls going about their daily routines. Rachel, with her mother's grace and her father's stubborn chin. Laura, who played the piano in the evenings, her music drifting out into the street like a bittersweet memory. And young Susan, who still tried to maintain their small garden despite the approaching winter. The sound of hooves on the hard-packed street drew Henry's attention. 3 riders approached the Anderson house, their long black coats marking them as Taylor Railroad men. He recognized Frank Clark's second-in-command, a scarred brute named Robert Taylor, leading them. As they dismounted, Henry's hand instinctively moved to his gun. But he forced himself to remain still. Acting now would only make things worse. He had to stick to the plan. Through his tears, Henry watched as the men entered the house. The sounds that followed would haunt him forever. Margaret's protests, the girls' screams, furniture being overturned. When they emerged, each man had a struggling Anderson daughter thrown across his saddle. Margaret ran after them into the street, her calls for help met with turned backs and closed doors. No one in Cheyenne dared to cross the Taylor Railroad Company. As the riders disappeared into the gathering dusk with their precious cargo, Henry emerged from his hiding place. He found Margaret crumpled in the street, her dress covered in dust. Gently, he helped her to her feet. "Mrs. Anderson," he said softly, "I was a friend of your husband's. and I swear to you on his grave, I'm going to bring your daughters home." Her tear-stained face turned to his, hope warring with despair in her eyes. "How?" "I'm going to need to resurrect some ghosts," Henry replied, his voice hardening with determination. "And then we're going to teach the Taylor Railroad Company that some debts can only be paid in blood." As he helped Margaret back into her house, his mind was already racing through the details of his plan. He had 2 weeks to gather his old gang and execute the most daring train robbery the frontier had ever seen. And this time, it wasn't about the money. It was about justice. As the last rays of sunlight faded behind the Wyoming mountains, Henry mounted his horse and headed south out of Cheyenne. His first stop would be El Paso, where Frank had settled down as a blacksmith after their gang disbanded 5 years ago. The cool night air carried the scent of sage and desert dust, stirring memories of their last job together, the one that had convinced Henry to hang up his guns and seek redemption. The 2-day ride gave Henry plenty of time to wrestle with his conscience. He'd promised Margaret Anderson he'd save her daughters, but assembling the old gang meant risking everything they'd built in their new lives. Frank had a wife now, Charlie ran a saloon in Deadwood, Daniel had become a horse trader in Dodge City, and Robert. Well, no one had heard from Robert since that bloody night in '78. But Henry knew he couldn't face the Taylor Railroad Company's private army alone. Approaching El Paso, Henry noticed how the town had grown. New buildings stretched toward the Mexican border, their fresh lumber stark against the adobe structures of the old quarter. He found Frank's smithy easily enough. The rhythmic ping of hammer on anvil led him straight there. The big man's shoulders tensed when Henry's shadow darkened his doorway. "Figured you'd show up someday," Frank said without turning around. "Heard about what happened in Cheyenne. Then you know why I'm here," Henry replied, stepping into the workshop's dim interior. The walls were lined with horseshoes and farm tools, honest work that Frank had built with his own hands. "I wouldn't ask if there was any other way." Frank finally turned, his face etched with the same internal struggle Henry had been fighting. He watched his old friend's expression shift, saw the familiar, righteous anger kindle in his eyes. "2 weeks," Henry continued. "That's all I need. Then you can come back to your forge and your family." Frank was silent for a long moment, the cooling iron on his anvil forgotten. Finally, he reached for a cloth to wipe his hands. "Martha's going to kill me," he muttered. "But she'd kill me slower if I turned my back on children in trouble. When do we ride?" Henry felt the first glimmer of hope since watching the Anderson girls being taken. "Dawn tomorrow. We need to get to Deadwood next. Charlie's got to be our inside man for the train job." That evening, Frank's wife Martha served them a quiet supper, her disapproval evident in every clipped word and sharp glance. But when Henry explained about the Anderson girls, her expression softened. "You bring him back to me in one piece," she said, as they prepared to leave the next morning, "and make those railroad bastards pay for what they've done." Henry promised, knowing that every mile north would bring them closer to both salvation and danger. As they rode out of El Paso, Frank filled Henry in on rumors he'd heard about their old companions. Charlie had prospered in Deadwood, his saloon becoming a gathering place for both miners and cattlemen. Daniel had expanded his horse trading operation, but kept to the straight and narrow. And Robert. Frank had heard whispers that Robert was running with a new gang near the Dakota Territory, though no one could say for certain. Henry absorbed the information silently, calculating their odds. They would need every man they could trust for what he had planned. The road to Deadwood would take them through some of the most lawless country in the West. But Henry knew the real danger waited at the end of their journey, in the form of a heavily armed payroll train and the men who would die to protect it. As the sun climbed higher, he thought of Margaret Anderson's tear-stained face and her 3 daughters in the hands of cruel men. Some debts could only be paid in blood, and Henry intended to extract payment in full. The late summer sun beat mercilessly on Henry Walker's weathered face as he studied the railroad schedule tacked to the wall of Cheyenne's bustling station. 10 years had passed since he'd last planned anything like this, but old habits died hard. His fingers traced the printed times, mind already calculating angles and opportunities. The Anderson sisters' predicament had dragged him back into a life he'd sworn to leave behind. But when Margaret, the eldest, had shown up at his door with tears streaming down her face, he knew he couldn't turn away. Frank Taylor lounged against the station's far wall, casually whittling a piece of pine while keeping watch. He'd been Henry's right hand during their outlaw days, and didn't hesitate when his old friend called. The railroad company's thugs had already moved Susan and Rachel Anderson to their compound outside town, using the girls as leverage to force their mother Martha to sign over the family's prime grazing land. Laura, the youngest at 16, remained at the ranch under guard. The whole scheme reeked of Robert Clark's handiwork. The railroad's head of acquisitions had built a reputation for using any means necessary to secure land for the expanding rail lines. Henry had crossed paths with Clark years ago during a failed train robbery, and still bore the bullet scar on his shoulder. Now Clark was using the dead rancher James Anderson's gambling markers to steal everything from his widow and daughters. "Charlie Moore's in town," Frank muttered, eyes fixed on a tall figure moving through the crowd. Henry tensed at the name. Charlie had been part of their old gang before turning lawman, and now served as Cheyenne's deputy marshal. He was a good man at heart, but his badge complicated things. They couldn't risk him catching wind of their plans. The sisters' lives depended on absolute secrecy. That evening, Henry met with Daniel Taylor, Frank's younger brother and their former gang's explosives expert, in the back room of the Golden Nugget Saloon. Daniel had been running a legitimate mining supply business in Deadwood, but dropped everything when Frank's telegram arrived. His expertise would be essential for breaching the reinforced door of the payroll car. The plan was coming together, but they needed more men. Martha Anderson paced her ranch house parlor as Henry laid out the basics of his strategy. "The railroad moves its payroll twice monthly on the Cheyenne-El Paso route," he explained. "We hit them hard enough, they'll be willing to negotiate. Clark won't risk losing both the money and his hostages." The widow's face was drawn with worry, but steel glinted in her eyes. "Do whatever you must, Mr. Walker. Just bring my girls home." 2 days later, Henry watched through his spyglass as a pair of Clark's men roughly escorted Rachel Anderson from the compound to a waiting carriage. The middle sister's once fine dress was soiled and torn, her proud bearing beaten down but not broken. Henry's jaw clenched at the sight. Clark was moving the girls separately to minimize risk, which meant they'd need to adjust their timeline. The payroll train was due in 4 days. Word came through Frank's contacts that Clark had hired additional muscle, a dozen hardened gunmen from down El Paso way. They'd be riding shotgun on the payroll run, supplementing the railroad's regular security detail. Henry had expected something like this, but the numbers changed the equation. They'd need every advantage they could get, including some help from an unexpected quarter. Late that night, Henry slipped into the marshal's office through the back window. Charlie Moore sat at his desk, predictably working late. "Figured you'd show up sooner or later," the deputy said without looking up. "Clark's got those girls locked down tight. You're planning something foolish, aren't you, old friend?" Henry settled into a chair, studying the man who'd once watched his back. "I need to know where you stand on this, Charlie. Those girls are innocent." The air crackled with tension as Charlie finally met Henry's gaze. "I've been gathering evidence on Clark for months," he said slowly. "Man's corrupt to the bone, but he's careful. Keeps everything just legal enough on paper." He pulled a folder from his desk drawer. "But this? Using young women as collateral? That crosses a line." Hope flickered in Henry's chest as his old friend continued. "I can't help you directly, but I might be able to ensure the marshal's office is looking the other way at the right moment." Back at the Golden Nugget, Frank and Daniel pored over detailed maps of the rail line while Henry brought them up to speed. The addition of Clark's hired guns meant they needed to revise their approach. A straight confrontation would be suicide. But if they could separate the payroll car from the rest of the train at a precise point, using Daniel's carefully placed charges. Henry allowed himself a grim smile. Sometimes the best plans were the ones that seemed impossible at first glance. Susan Anderson's muffled sobs echoed through the compound's stone walls as Clark's men transferred her to a different room. In the adjacent cell, Rachel pressed her face to the bars, straining to catch a glimpse of her sister. Their captors had been careful to keep them apart, knowing the sisters' strength lay in their unity. But Rachel had faith. She'd seen Henry Walker watching from the hills and remembered the stories her father used to tell about the legendary outlaw who'd once saved his life. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the canyon walls as Charlie rode hard toward the rendezvous point, his horse's hooves kicking up clouds of red dust. He'd spent 3 days tracking down Robert in a backwater saloon near Deadwood, convincing their former demolitions expert to join what could well be their last job together. The promise of both redemption and revenge had finally swayed the reluctant man. Daniel's calculations had revealed a vulnerable stretch of track where the grade steepened just before a sharp bend, forcing the train to slow considerably. The payroll car would be heavily guarded, but physics and geography would be on their side. As he sketched detailed diagrams in the dirt, Frank noticed how the former engineer's hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. One miscalculation could cost them everything. Martha Anderson paced the floor of her empty home, running her fingers along the spines of her late husband's leather-bound ledgers. The railroad's claims were false. She knew Thomas had kept meticulous records of every transaction, but Clark's men had ransacked the study weeks ago, taking anything that might prove her case. Her daughters' lives now hung on the desperate gambit of trusting outlaws, men her husband had once called friends. In the gathering dusk, Henry and Frank made their way through the twisting arroyos toward Clark's compound. They needed to confirm the sisters were still there before committing to their plan. The guards had grown complacent, making their rounds with predictable timing. Through his spyglass, Henry caught glimpses of Laura in an upper window, her face pale but determined as she comforted her younger sister Susan through the wall between their rooms. Rachel had managed to work a loose nail from her cell's wooden bed frame, carefully scratching markings into the stone wall to track the days. 2 weeks had passed since their capture, but she refused to let despair take hold. During the guards' shift changes, she'd heard snippets of conversation about a payroll shipment and increased security. Something was coming. She could feel it in the tension that filled the compound. Back in Cheyenne, Robert worked through the night in a borrowed blacksmith shop, modifying mining charges to Daniel's exact specifications. The familiar work brought back memories of jobs past, both legitimate and otherwise. He'd sworn never to return to this life, but the thought of innocent women held captive for nothing more than their father's good name had awakened something in him he thought long buried. Henry's plan relied on precise timing and the element of surprise, but also on the loyalty of men who had once been as close as brothers. As Frank watched their leader studying the compound's layout, he recognized the careful calculation in his eyes. They weren't young men anymore. This wasn't about glory or riches. This was about setting right a terrible wrong, whatever the cost. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the Golden Nugget with news from her connections in El Paso. The payroll shipment would be larger than expected, with armed guards from 3 different security companies. Clark was taking no chances, but her eyes sparkled as she added that she'd also learned which engine would be pulling the train, and more importantly, which engineer would be at the controls. As the sun climbed higher, Daniel walked the length of track where they would make their stand, measuring distances with practiced steps. The ghost of his former life as a railroad man seemed to walk beside him, reminding him of everything he'd lost when the company had turned on its own. Perhaps this was why Henry had sought him out, not just for his skills, but because he understood the true cost of justice delayed. The pieces of Henry's plan were falling into place, but time was running short. In 3 days, the payroll train would depart from Dodge City, carrying not only its precious cargo but the fate of 3 innocent women. As the old gang gathered one by one, each bringing their unique skills and shared history, the weight of their mission settled over them like the desert heat. This would be their last ride together. And it had to count. The late autumn wind howled through Deadwood's narrow streets as Henry Anderson crouched behind an overturned wagon, his weathered hands gripping the worn Colt revolver. Behind him, Frank Moore and Charlie Clark kept their eyes fixed on the railroad office where Robert Taylor's men held the 3 daughters of widow Margaret Walker. The plan they'd spent weeks perfecting was unraveling faster than a cheap saddle blanket, and Henry could feel time slipping away like sand through his fingers. Through the grimy window, he caught glimpses of Susan, Rachel, and Laura Walker, their faces pale in the lamplight. The youngest Laura couldn't have been more than 16. The sight of them bound and terrified made his blood boil, remembering how Taylor had manipulated their mother's grief after her husband's death, twisting old debts into a noose around the family's neck. But Henry hadn't survived 20 years as an outlaw by letting anger cloud his judgment. Frank shifted restlessly beside him, the old wound in his leg making him grimace. Taylor's got at least 15 men in there, Henry. This ain't like the old days when we could just shoot our way clear. He wasn't wrong. The railroad had brought more than just steel rails to the territory. It had brought an army of hired guns who answered only to men like Taylor, men who wrapped their greed in the respectable clothes of progress and civilization. The original plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Hit the payroll train outside of Cheyenne, use the money to clear Margaret's debts, and ensure Taylor could never threaten another widow or orphan. But Taylor had somehow caught wind of their scheme. Now he held the Walker girls as insurance, knowing Henry wouldn't risk their lives with a direct assault. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Henry. He'd spent years trying to atone for his past, only to find redemption required one last return to violence. Charlie's voice cut through Henry's dark thoughts. "Look there, by the loading dock." Through the gathering dusk, three figures moved between the shadows of stacked crates. Henry recognized Daniel Moore, Frank's younger brother, leading Martha Clark and her two ranch hands. They'd managed to get into position despite the chaos. Maybe there was still a chance to salvage this mess without turning Deadwood streets into a killing ground. The plan had shifted like quicksand beneath their feet, but Henry had learned long ago that survival often meant dancing to fortune's tune. Martha's presence was no accident. As the widow of Deadwood's former marshal, she still commanded respect from the town's more law-abiding citizens. More importantly, she had access to the network of tunnels beneath the railroad office, remnants of abandoned mining operations that honeycombed the earth beneath the town. Henry passed silent signals to his scattered allies, positioning them for what would come next. The sun had nearly set, painting the sky in deep purples and angry reds. In minutes, the church bell would toll 6 times, and Martha would make her move. Henry's fingers tightened around his revolver as memories of his last great heist flooded back. The screams, the blood, the weight of guilt that had driven him to seek redemption. He'd sworn never to return to that life, but fate had other plans. The bell began to toll, its bronze voice echoing off the buildings. Right on cue, Martha Clark strode purposefully toward the railroad office's front door, her black dress and stern demeanor drawing every eye. Henry watched Taylor's men scramble to attention, their nervousness evident even at this distance. Martha had that effect on people. Her reputation for moral rectitude was as fearsome as any gunslinger's notoriety. While Martha created her diversion, Daniel and the ranch hands slipped into the tunnel entrance concealed behind the loading dock. Henry counted the seconds, knowing they would need exactly 3 minutes to reach the office's basement. The plan depended on precise timing and more than a little luck. But then, Henry reflected, luck had always been a fickle partner in his line of work. Time stretched like molasses as Henry waited for the signal. He could see Susan Walker through the window now, her face showing the same stubborn determination he'd seen in her mother's eyes. The girls hadn't broken under pressure. They were their father's daughters, after all. Henry had known James Walker in the early days, before the railroad came. A good man, killed by the same greed that now threatened his family. The sharp crack of breaking glass shattered the evening's tension. Smoke began pouring from the office's basement windows. Daniel signaled that they were in position. Martha Clark's voice rose above the sudden commotion, berating Taylor's men with the righteous fury of a frontier preacher. In the confusion, Henry and his team moved like shadows toward their targets. 20 years of experience guided their steps, each man knowing his role without need for words. What followed was a symphony of controlled chaos. As Taylor's men rushed to investigate the smoke, Henry's team slipped through their disorganized ranks. Frank and Charlie covered the front while Henry made his way to the second floor. The element of surprise was complete. By the time Taylor realized what was happening, Henry had already reached the room where the Walker girls were held. The confrontation with Taylor himself was almost anticlimactic. The railroad man's courage, like his power, derived from having others do his dirty work. Finding himself alone against Henry Anderson's leveled revolver, Taylor's bluster evaporated like morning dew. The ledger in his safe provided the final proof of his schemes, not just against the Walkers, but dozens of other families he'd defrauded across the territory. As Henry led the Walker girls to safety through the tunnel system, he felt the weight of years lifting from his shoulders. This wasn't the redemption he'd imagined, but perhaps it was the one he deserved. Martha Clark was already organizing the townspeople, ensuring Taylor's crimes would see the light of justice. Sometimes, Henry reflected, the path to righteousness required walking through the shadows one last time. The celebration in Dodge City was short-lived. As Henry and the Walker sisters made their way through the winding tunnel system beneath the town, the rhythmic thunder of hooves echoed from above. Taylor's men had returned early from their patrol, and the sound of shouting filtered down through the earthen ceiling. They had precious little time before their escape route would be discovered. Henry guided them through the darkness, one hand on the rough-hewn wall, the other gripping his Colt. Behind him, Rachel helped steady Susan, who was still weak from their captivity. Margaret, the eldest, carried a lantern that cast dancing shadows along the passage. The tunnel had been built by Chinese railroad workers years ago, a secret network that had served smugglers and outlaws well. Now it would serve justice. The passage emerged half a mile outside town, hidden beneath an abandoned windmill. As they climbed into the dying light of dusk, gunfire erupted from the direction of Dodge City. Frank and Charlie had stayed behind to cover their escape, and now they were buying time with their lives. Henry's jaw clenched. He wouldn't leave his men behind, not again. "Martha's waiting at the old Carson ranch," he told the sisters, pointing toward the distant silhouette of a weathered barn. "Get there and stay hidden. No matter what you hear, don't come back." Margaret started to protest, but Henry's expression brooked no argument. They'd come too far to fail now. As the women disappeared into the gathering darkness, Henry turned back toward town, checking his ammunition one final time. The streets of Dodge City had erupted into chaos. Taylor's men were engaged in a running gunfight with Frank and Charlie, who had taken positions in the abandoned church tower. But it was Robert's distraction that turned the tide. He'd set fire to the railroad office, and the flames were spreading rapidly through the wooden buildings. In the confusion, Henry managed to work his way behind Taylor's gunmen. The final confrontation played out in the flickering orange light of the burning town. Henry's first shot took down Taylor's right-hand man, while Frank's rifle cracked from above, dropping another. The remaining hired guns, seeing their employer's scheme crumbling around them, began to melt away into the night. Taylor himself emerged from his office, clutching his precious ledger, only to find himself surrounded by Henry's reformed outlaws. But it was Martha Clark who delivered the final justice. She appeared from the shadows, wielding not a gun but a badge, a U.S. Marshal's star that glinted in the firelight. She'd been working undercover for months, building a case against Taylor's railroad syndicate. The ledger would provide the final evidence needed to bring down not just Taylor, but his entire corrupt network stretching from El Paso to Deadwood. As dawn broke over the smoldering remains of Dodge City's railroad district, Henry watched Taylor and his surviving men being led away in chains. The Walker sisters had been reunited with their mother, their property restored through Martha's legal authority. Frank and Charlie nursed their wounds, already talking about returning to honest ranching work. For the first time in years, Henry felt clean, as if the dust of his outlaw past had finally been washed away. Yet something still pulled at him, a restlessness that wouldn't quite fade. Martha found him at the edge of town, staring toward the distant horizon. "The territory still needs good men," she said quietly. "Men who understand both sides of the law." Henry turned to face her, seeing in her eyes the same fierce dedication to justice that had driven him through this vendetta. Perhaps there was still one more chapter to write in his story of redemption. The next morning, as Henry rode out of Dodge City with a U.S. Marshal's badge of his own, he reflected on how strangely fate worked its hand. He had started this journey seeking personal vengeance, only to find a greater purpose. Behind him, the Walker sisters waved goodbye from their restored homestead, while ahead lay the vast expanse of the border territories, still wild, still lawless, but now with one more guardian to help tame them. The thundering hooves of 24 horses echoed across the desert plain as Daniel Walker's gang approached the railroad trestle bridge spanning Eagle Canyon. The reformed outlaw studied the towering iron framework through his spyglass, noting the armed guards positioned at both ends. Behind him, his reassembled crew waited tensely, veteran outlaws drawn back into action by loyalty and the promise of one final score that would right a grievous wrong against the innocent Anderson sisters. Henry Clark, Daniel's longtime friend and former second-in-command, rode up beside him. "Tracks clear for 3 miles in both directions," he reported in a low voice. "Telegraph lines are cut. Charlie's got the charges set under the east support. We're ready when you give the word." Daniel nodded grimly, thinking of Margaret Anderson and her daughters imprisoned in the railroad company's private jail in El Paso. The plan was audacious but necessary. Derail the heavily guarded payroll train, liberate the company's ill-gotten wealth, and use it as leverage to force the release of Susan, Rachel, and Laura Anderson. Their only crime had been inheriting their father's debts to the corrupt railroad baron Robert Taylor. who had seized them as collateral when their mother couldn't pay. The injustice of it had drawn Daniel out of peaceful retirement and back into a life he'd sworn to leave behind. Frank Moore, the gang's explosives expert, materialized from the shadows of a rock outcropping. "Charges are all set, boss. Soon as that train hits the triggered section, the whole east end of the bridge goes. She'll derail clean into the canyon. Shouldn't be more than a 30-foot drop. Enough to stop her, not enough to kill anyone if they're smart enough to jump." His practiced eye surveyed the gathering storm clouds. "Better move quick, though. That rain hits. Could cause problems with the det cord." Lightning flickered on the horizon as Daniel considered the forces arrayed against them. Taylor's private army of hired guns would fight hard to protect their employer's gold shipment. But Daniel had chosen his crew carefully. Men who had ridden with him in the old days, when his gang's code of honor had made them heroes to the common folk even as the law branded them outlaws. Men who would die before letting innocent women suffer at a tyrant's hands. The distant whistle of the approaching train echoed off the canyon walls. Daniel drew his revolver and checked the load one final time. "Remember, we're after the gold car only. No unnecessary killing. Taylor's men are just doing their jobs. But anyone who stands between us and freeing those girls..." He left the implicit threat hanging. His men nodded grimly, checking their own weapons. Thunder rolled across the desert as the train rounded the distant bend, its headlamp cutting through the growing gloom. Daniel raised his arm, waiting for the precise moment. The bridge charges had to be triggered at exactly the right time. Too soon, and the train crew might spot the danger and brake. Too late, and the entire train would plunge into the canyon. Years of experience had taught him the importance of timing. The explosion when it came was deafening, even over the storm. The east support of the bridge collapsed in a controlled cascade, dropping the tracks at a precise angle. The locomotive's wheels left the rails exactly as planned, sliding to a relatively gentle stop in the sandy creek bed below. Within seconds, Daniel's men were swarming the derailed train while others provided covering fire from the ridge. The fighting was brief but intense. Taylor's guards were professionals, but they were also trapped in a vulnerable position with limited cover. Within minutes, they surrendered. Daniel personally led the team that breached the armored gold car, efficiently transferring its contents to waiting pack horses. The whole operation had taken less than 15 minutes, a testament to careful planning and experienced execution. As they rode hard through the storm toward their designated hideout, Daniel allowed himself a grim smile. Phase 1 was complete. Now came the delicate task of negotiating with Taylor, trading his gold for the Anderson sisters' freedom. The railroad baron was a proud man, but Daniel knew his type well. Money always trumped pride in the end. By this time tomorrow, Margaret Anderson would have her daughters back. The hideout was an abandoned silver mine in the foothills, easily defended, multiple escape routes, and known only to Daniel's most trusted men. As they secured the gold and posted watches, Henry approached with a troubled expression. "Rider coming in. It's Martha Walker." Daniel's sister Martha worked as a cook at Taylor's El Paso mansion. Her presence here could only mean complications. Martha's news was worse than Daniel had feared. Taylor had somehow learned of their planned raid and moved the Anderson sisters to his private hunting lodge in the mountains near Deadwood. "He's using them as bait," Martha explained. "Figures you'll come after them, wants to trap you there. Place is crawling with hired guns." Daniel cursed softly. The simple exchange he'd planned had just become much more complicated. A heated debate broke out among the gang. Some argued for taking the gold and disappearing. They had enough to split several ways and live like kings. Others insisted they couldn't abandon the women to Taylor's mercy. Daniel listened silently, weighing options. Finally, he spoke. "I'm riding to Deadwood. Anyone who wants to keep their share and leave, no hard feelings. The rest of you, saddle up. We've got some ladies to rescue." To Daniel's pride but not surprise, every man chose to ride with him. They cached most of the gold, keeping only enough to fund their rescue mission. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clear as they headed north. Daniel knew Taylor would be expecting them. The element of surprise was gone. But he had a few tricks left, and a lifetime of experience fighting against superior numbers. In the end, it came down to knowing your enemy. Taylor was predictable in his arrogance. He'd concentrated his forces around the lodge itself, assuming any rescue attempt would be a frontal assault. He never expected Daniel's men to start a forest fire as a diversion, or to infiltrate through the old mine tunnels that honeycombed the mountain. By the time Taylor realized he'd been outmaneuvered, the Anderson sisters were already safely away. The final confrontation took place at dawn in the lodge's grand hall. Taylor, trapped by the approaching flames, faced Daniel across an ornate desk. "You've lost everything," Daniel told him quietly. "The gold, your hostages, even your reputation once word of this gets out. Walk away, start fresh somewhere else, or don't. Your choice." He left Taylor sitting there as smoke began to curl under the door, knowing the man's pride would never let him admit defeat by fleeing. Epilogue came in the form of a small ceremony in Dodge City, where Margaret Anderson used part of the recovered gold to establish a shelter for women and children victimized by powerful men. Susan married Charlie Moore, while Rachel and Laura used their shares to attend university back east. Daniel Walker disappeared back into quiet retirement, though some say he still rides out occasionally when innocent people need help against those who abuse their power. The story became legend in the border territories, how a reformed outlaw and his loyal gang had struck one final blow against corruption and greed. But the deeper truth was known only to those who had lived it, that justice sometimes wears an outlaw's face, and that true redemption comes not from walking away from past sins, but from using the skills learned in darkness to serve the light. Years passed, and the legend of the Anderson sisters' rescue grew with each retelling in saloons and around campfires across the border territories. What few knew was how that single act of defiance had rippled outward, changing not just the lives of those directly involved, but reshaping the very fabric of justice in those untamed lands. Margaret's shelter in Dodge City became a beacon of hope, drawing women from as far as Cheyenne and El Paso seeking refuge from powerful men who thought themselves above the law. The widow Anderson proved as formidable in running the sanctuary as she had been in fighting for her daughter's freedom, turning away no one in need while maintaining strict standards that earned respect from even her harshest critics. Susan and Charlie Moore's ranch outside Dodge City grew into a way station for those seeking new beginnings. Their barn often housed travelers with familiar faces, former outlaws looking to follow Daniel Walker's path to redemption. Charlie never turned them away, remembering his own second chance, though Susan insisted they all work honest labor during their stay. Rachel's medical studies back east bore unexpected fruit when she returned to establish the territory's first proper hospital in Deadwood. Her experiences during their captivity had awakened a fierce determination to heal both bodies and spirits. More than one wounded outlaw found themselves receiving treatment with no questions asked, though each understood the debt they now owed to society. Laura took a different path, using her education to become a formidable lawyer who specialized in defending those who had no voice against railroad companies and cattle barons. She kept an office in Cheyenne but traveled the territories, taking cases that reminded her of her family's struggle. More than once, mysterious evidence supporting her clients appeared on her desk, bearing the subtle hallmarks of Daniel Walker's influence. Daniel himself was rarely seen, but his presence was felt throughout the border territories. Ranch hands spoke of a gray-haired rider who appeared at crucial moments to prevent injustice, while corrupt officials found their schemes unexpectedly exposed. He never stayed long enough to be thanked, preferring to let his actions speak for him.